Welcome, everybody. It's a treat for all of us to be in Chicago, to be at the Institute for Politics. I do want a mug. I just want to make that very clear, if that's possible, at the end of this thing. Covering the White House, I think what's great about having this group here is you're going to get an inside feel for what it's like and what it's like in this administration. I covered the Bush administration along with Dana, and I remember when it was shocking back in 1999 when I was covering Governor Bush. And I introduced my father to him at a rope line, and he walked up and he said, "You claim him?" And he said, "Your boy's a good man, kind of a pain in the ass, but a good man." I thought that was eyebrow raising for how to talk to the media. But things have changed. Dana, what is it like? What has changed covering this president,
I don't know why
this
you think things have changed. It's so similar.
Yeah.
Really, it's so humdrum. And where do we even
inside.
start?
What's changed? What's different?
Where do we even start? I think, honestly, the thing that is most disturbing, that is different, is that, we didn't always have the most warm and fuzzy relationship with the Bush White House, and the same can be said of those who covered the Obama White House. But I think it's fair to say that when a reporter had a story that he or she knew was right, and the White House knew was right, that for the most part, the source, if you want to check it, say, officially, we're going to go with this. The White House official response was, I cannot confirm this for you, but I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong. Or I'm not going to tell you that you're fake news and you're lying. And that happens on a pretty regular basis. And Julie, you guys can both speak much more to this than I. But I've had that experience where I have explicitly been told, if you go to air with this, you will be wrong. And it was 100% right and turned out to be right. And you have to make a really, really big leap, because when somebody from an official point of view is telling you that you are wrong and you will be wrong and it will be inaccurate, you obviously have to check your sources.
And have you gone back to that person and said, "Hey, you said it was absolutely wrong, it was 100% right, I can't trust you"?
No.
No.
There's kind of no point, really.
Julie, is that your experience? Again, this is inside, you're working a story, you're going to an official like a press secretary, communications person. By the way, just the structure of this White House, how is it different than in other administrations?
Sure. And I apologize in advance. I have what we've been referring to in our bureau as the shutdown plague. So I'll be sniffling a little bit throughout this. I think Dana really hit on it. In the Obama administration, and from talking to my colleagues who covered the Bush administration, yes, there was a tension between the White House and the White House press office and the reporters. There has to be. But there was also a level of trust where you felt like you could go to them and say, "Hey, I'm going to say this. I'm not going to be wrong," right? And as Dana pointed out, they would rarely confirm it, but they would at least give you a nod. With this administration, either they don't respond, they will tell you your story is flat wrong. Often the president himself will then later confirm that it was right. And it puts you in this position where you find yourself not doing the things that you do in basic journalism. You're going to the White House and saying, "Hey, we just want fair comment for this. We just want to make you aware of this." I worry a little bit that for some of our younger colleagues who are coming up on this beat, that they're going to get out of that habit. But it's also very strategic on the part of this White House. If they can just deny, if they can say something is fake news, they know that a certain segment of the population will believe them, even if the story is 100% accurate.
There's a sense, just to stay on this level of it, McKay, which is, part of covering the White House, even if you're not there every day, but if you're there often and you're traveling, you get to know the players you're around. And, Bill Plant, who was with CBS for many years, said you can gain a lot of understanding by being on the margins of an event, say. Or I remember right before the Afghanistan war, I was there in the West Wing, and I saw the makeup artist who I knew go from the office over to the residence, and I knew that meant the president was getting ready to announce that we were invaded Afghanistan. So you get to know people, you get to know the rhythms of the president. Is that different, McKay?
It is. So I covered the Trump campaign and got to know some of these players there. And it's weird. So I covered the Romney campaign in 2012, so 4 years earlier. And you would develop, especially when you're out on the campaign trail so much, you would develop a weird kind of frenemy relationship with a lot of the people on the campaign, where you had a fundamentally antagonistic relationship, but you also kind of respected each other and you understood that each person had a job to do. And I have to say, I did not, it was hard for, and I don't think I was alone, it was hard to develop that kind of relationship with the Trump campaign, and that's extended into his presidency.
Right, because it's really all about him. He has the relationships, and a lot of us in the media complain about lots of things, and we'll break those down. But let's be honest about one thing. Far more than President Obama, far more than President Bush, he'll talk to you.
Yeah.
I mean, he'll talk to you everywhere. You better be ready everywhere. He'll walk into the helicopter, walk into the bathroom, and he'll just talk to you all the time.
Just in the hallways, the West Wing.
You can shout a question, and he will answer you. This is what we say we always want.
And we do want it. In some respects, and I know David will
He may call you a
this.
horrible person, but you know.
Yeah, in some respects, there is much more transparency around this president as a singular figure than there was about Obama. I don't think I really had a sense day to day of what was going on in Obama's mind. With Trump, I know by 6:30 most mornings what's going on in his mind.
And that's Twitter too, Dan.
Yeah,
but the fact that the president talks so much, you know, this notion that he hates the media, I like to point out, and you can agree or disagree, this is all a game. You know, we're rushing to say that this is, you know, an authoritarian at work. No, this is, I always say that this is a guy who can't quit Maggie Haberman of the New York Times.
That is such an important point.
Right, because he feeds off of it. He's a creation of media attention, and it's oxygen for him. Yes. He loves it as much as he hates it.
Let me give you an example, an anecdote to back that up. I don't know if you guys remember, because it's like, you know, it's like dog years. There's so much that happens on a daily basis, but when the president invited his the military brass, and they weren't, it was supposed to be a closed press, and then he decided to bring the cameras in, and they were there with their spouses. It was a kind of a social event, and he just blurts out to the cameras, "How do you like this? The calm before the storm." And everyone is thinking, "Are we going to war tomorrow? Like, what's happening?" I was told by somebody he talked to that he went up to the residence, he kicked his feet back, he watched cable news, and he just was enjoying the way that everybody was spinning to try to figure out what the commander-in-chief was talking about when he said, "This is the calm before the storm." So that's, I think, an anecdote that backs up. I don't believe that it's hard to imagine that he doesn't understand that the stakes are real, but in addition to that, he understands how to play the media, and he very much enjoys it.
Though I would say it's not just a game, because a game connotes the idea that it's all just for show and it's all for performance. I think he personalizes his relationship with the media in a way that no president has, at least in a long time, maybe since Richard Nixon. You know, they mentioned in the introduction, I am among many reporters who he's called out by name on Twitter or at campaign events or whatever. He knows the reporters by name, has very specific things he doesn't like about them. He will go after them, he'll taunt them, whatever. But part of this is, like you said, he can't quit Maggie Haberman from the New York Times. This is a guy who is a creature of the New York media, the New York tabloids in particular. He became who he was, this kind of famous figure, by courting the New York Post and the gossip columns in the New York Daily News. And in a way, he's always, I think, wanted to be taken seriously by the esteemed, publications like the New York Times. And even now as president, although you could probably argue it very rarely works out in his favor, he still is calling up the New York Times, trying to get them to write the stories he wants. He just wants that affection, that attention from them in a way that I don't think any president in decades
But he believes he's his best advocate. And so, Julie, and to all of you, I mean, let me be deliberately provocative. Why are we so exercised by his assertion of fake news? Isn't he just colloquializing the notion of kind of unfair news, taking it a step beyond? And remember that whether it was Joseph Stalin or the Nazi regime, they are people who actually dismantled the apparatus of a free press and replaced it with an organized propaganda arm. He hasn't even gone after leakers in the way that that David Axelrod directed President Obama to do.
I would say there are two sides of this. It is true that a lot of what we feared at the start of this administration in terms of press access, our ability to cover the White House, has not come true. The briefings continue. They are on camera. We are still working out of offices in the West Wing, which was an open question for a while. We are still traveling with the president on Air Force One. We still see him most days. And as I said, we can have more access to him than we did with previous presidents in some cases. That's the positive side. I actually think that the fake news campaign is really dangerous. And it's not just dangerous here. I work for the Associated Press. We have reporters all over the world in countries where it's incredibly dangerous to work. We also have reporters in countries where there's an expectation that there's a free and fair press. They're Western-style democracies. We have seen in Israel. We have seen in Europe. We have seen certainly in places like Turkey and Russia, other leaders picking up the fake news term and taking it further than he has. And that, to me, is the dangerous effect. It's not just what's happening in our press corps, but it's this feeling among other leaders who are willing to cross the line that they can, that he's opened this door and they can walk through it.
And Hannah Arendt, the political theorist who wrote The Origins of Totalitarianism, talked about how the immensity of the truth, if that is somehow corrupted, then you lose. And then that liberal democracies were the bastion of truth and the protectors of truth. So this is not to be trivialized.
No, absolutely. Listen, I am not one of those people who stands on a soapbox and I take it seriously, but I don't take it to heart. I don't take myself too seriously. I mean, this is something that gets me crazy, this term fake news, for two reasons. One is, as Julie said, because he is the leader of the free world, and other leaders around the globe take their signals from him. And you remember when we covered George W. Bush, every time he met with Putin, he would press him on backsliding on a free and fair press. I mean, can you imagine that in this environment? And it was important to him because he understood the role of the United States president when it came to free press. And the second reason why it bothers me is because there is actual fake news out there. Now we know about it, that the Russians, worked it with Facebook and other social media outlets. And that's what we have to be worried about. There is an active attempt constantly, and we'll probably see it spike as we get closer to November, to the midterms, to disseminate really false and fake information. And to blur the lines between that and what we do is so irresponsible and dangerous.
How much, just one aside, so when Bush met with Putin, his last meeting with him in Slovenia, and he brought up this press backsliding and press freedom backsliding, and Putin, who would sit like this, got really angry and said to Bush, he said, "Don't lecture me." He said, "You're the one who had Dan Rather fired." And Bush apparently said, "Vladimir, you can't say stuff like that. People are going to think you're nuts." And it was just a case of how bad things had gotten between them. The other side of that is that the way that the news media have fractured and become kind of communities has led a lot of people that I talk to so divided. I hear this especially about CNN, that there's a tonnage to the news about Trump. There's an obsessiveness about it, and it is that it borders on hate for Trump, and that people have a revulsion to that. They think it's too much, and they think it's unfair, down to the Chirons that say, Trump report misleadingly claims X, Y, or Z. That is a new step in the coverage of a president with this president, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's very different. It's very different. And I think that the key thing that you just touched on isn't so much the individual segments or comments that people make. Take it in totality, and it's the volume. Funny thing about the Chirons that you talk about, I recently talked to somebody who talks to Trump a lot, who told me that the president and the people around him are convinced that Jeff Zucker, our boss, writes the Chirons in a specific way just to get under Trump's skin. I was like, you guys are giving us way too much credit.
Yeah, right, right. But how do you all comment on that? I mean, there's a lot of this coursing through the media now.
I do think that we have to be careful as a press corps to not make everything a 10. Yeah. There is this impulse.
Right. Everything is not firing James Comey.
Everything is not the end of the democracy. Mm-hmm. I think there are some things that could border on those kind of questions, but not everything. And I think that we lose trust with our audiences when we immediately go to the extreme, when we immediately say, this is unprecedented. One thing I've been pushing our reporters to do is to read a little bit more about history, because, we have had presidents that have said really controversial things. We have had presidents that have said racist things. We've had presidents that have attacked the media. We have to put this in context. Some of what is so striking about Trump is that we're hearing about it in real time, that it's either coming through his Twitter feed, his own comments, his own advisors disseminating it to the media. But not everything he does is actually unprecedented and the first time ever that it's happened in the White House.
And I think this is one of the toxic effects that the Trump era has had in the press, because I think that because Trump is unprecedented in so many ways and defies conventions and norms in a lot of ways, early on in the Trump era, starting with his campaign and then into his presidency, there was a lot of kind of manic intensity in trying to explain and convey to readers or viewers just how different this was. But the problem is now I think that a lot of audiences have become desensitized to the news and about Trump, and now everything has to be a bombshell even to just get people's attention, right? I think every story is written as though it's this massive, huge thing, because otherwise, frankly, there is a financial incentive or traffic incentive or ratings incentive, but also just because we feel like readers will just, forget it or ignore it unless it's conveyed as a massive world-shaking bombshell. And I think that that's a problem.
One of the things that I think we lack in our coverage is, when a president goes overseas, you tend to cover it. It was always said about, Terry, who he would write it big and he would write it pretty. And the idea that you're capturing this big, this big mosaic, almost like, the portraitist David for Napoleon, when he would do a battle scene, you go to the Louvre and it's this huge tapestry, this huge canvas, that we have to do that with Trump to be able to paint the reality show piece that goes on the very day when the markets are up dramatically, and that's impacting a lot of people, because it's all part of this whole where we have to try to understand who and what he is, don't you think?
Yes, and it makes it so much harder when you have a president who is sometimes intentionally, sometimes not intentionally saying, don't look at that, look at this red ball over here that I'm going to tweet about. And, and really, sometimes it is unintentional, because his people in the White House are tearing their hair out because the market is at a crazy high. The job numbers are very good. And instead, he's making a nickname up for some senator, and that's getting the attention instead of really talking about the things that any other president would be talking about.
But so are we losing some of that, McKay? In other words, are we so focused on, everybody said about cable news, you have so much time, but the truth is we spend a lot of time on relatively few issues because we magnify them because that's what gets the most attention, when there's a big mosaic to be painting here to really understand this guy.
What's missing in a lot of coverage of Trump, and that this is across mediums, is the zooming out, right? The zooming out and placing him in a context of what's going on. But you're right, this is the great irony of the 24-hour news cycle and the cable news and everything else, is that yeah, we talk about, oh, there's so much time now and there's so much space. Writing for the internet, there's no, limited number of inches that you can write for. But then we all write the same stories. We all chase the same soccer ball. It's like, Trump is kicking the soccer ball on a field and we're all swarming toward it, right? I do think, though, that there have been good examples of this. There's been some magazines have done good work. The Washington Post has done great, deep investigative stories. The New York Times, of course, too. There have been examples of it, but again, I come back to this problem that we were talking about, where unless it's framed in the kind of hysteria or pitched as kind of with manic intensity, a lot of it gets lost, and people just are so obsessed on the minutia of the moment.
One thing that has actually been heartening, though, since I've been in my new job, I've been really digging into our metrics, what stories are being used, and the thing about the AP is that our stories are being used by other news organizations around the country and around the world. The Trump stories always do well. If there's a Trump controversy, you can bet that it's being used. Stories about Supreme Court decisions, stories about energy policy in particular, some of the things that have been happening at the Interior Department and the Department of Education do incredibly well. And that has been really heartening to know that in Washington, it feels like there's one story. It feels like everyone is, running in the same direction. But actually, I have found that the public has a broader set of interests. I think our challenge is to take advantage of that and write deeper and say, how are these policies being made? What are the influencers behind these decisions? How does this connect back to the White House? Because I actually think the audience is there, and I think as this presidency goes on, there will be more of a hunger for the non-Trump story and the not shiny object story.
There is hatred and disgust for this president. Do you think that is reflected too often in the media?
Sure. I mean, I think too often.
And how does that get corrected? Is that the challenge ahead to face?
Here's the way I'll answer that question. And that is that throughout the 2016 campaign, it is true that people who are living on the coast, for the most part, many of them in the big cities, they didn't get the Trump phenomenon because they thought he was a joke and would never win and so forth. But the people who did vote for Trump, I mean, we see this in the polling, but just even anecdotally, even with all the crazy stuff that he does, still think that he's better than the alternative. So many Trump voters are still cheering him on. And I think that to use your word, in the hysteria of the minute-to-minute news cycles that Trump provides, that it is important to take a step back and remember that those people still exist. And you've seen a lot of stories over the past week or so as everybody has been doing their retrospectives of the first year in the Trump presidency. And it's kind of remarkable how that dynamic that everybody was sort of wringing their hands about after the election, saying, how did we miss this, is still happening.
Yeah, but I would say that there's the business of, it is almost criminal in journalistic circles to normalize Trump.
Oh.
And
well, let me give you, can I just give you an example of that? And this is one of those days I just turned off my notifications on my Twitter feed. The day that what Lindsey Graham calls the Tuesday Trump, the day that he had all of the senators, bipartisan senators, maybe I was on TV with you after that, I'm not sure, but and he was trying to be not the guy in Fire and Fury, and he was trying to be presidential and try to be agreeable to everybody and brought everybody in the room. And I said afterwards, I leaned very far into it, and I said, if this was the guy, never mind the fact that he mixed up some of the policy, but just in terms of the performance, if this was the guy that showed up every day since last January 20th, this is the guy that a lot of people hoped would be the president, bringing people in to make deals. Oh my God, it was as if I said that he should be canonized. I got so attacked for normalizing it. And look, the next day he wasn't that guy. He was another guy. He was the other guy. But just even in that moment, and I don't regret it, because that was a flash of something that was leadership, that was bringing people together, the kind of thing that a president should be doing.
And people who say they want fair, accurate, balanced coverage, I find that sometimes on the left, they actually just really want exclusively anti-Trump coverage.
Totally.
Everyone is coming at this from a bias, and you're right. If you write something that says, this was a good day, this was a victory for the president, this was a success for this White House, the blowback is incredible. We've also seen it in coverage of communities that supported Trump and continue to support Trump. I mean, one of the lessons for the media out of this election is that we didn't pay enough attention to some of these communities, or we paid attention, but we didn't actually think they would go through with voting for Trump. And so now we are trying to spend more time there. And we just get lambasted sometimes for doing that. And I think it's just so ironic. We are trying to spend more time actually talking to people and understanding what motivates them. And it is true that overwhelmingly those voters have shown us that they are still with him. And so there is a repetitiveness to the story, but I don't think it's a wasted exercise.
So I'll push back a little on that. But because I think that this genre of some X thing happened in political news, and now let's go to the same West Virginia town and ask coal miners what they thought about it. I think the problem with it is not the intention. And actually, AP is an example of people who do it right, because a big problem is there's a structural issue here, which is that it's political reporters from DC and New York parachuting into these towns for 2 or 3 days and just asking people on the street what they thought about that. That's fine. It's better than not doing it. It would be a lot better if these New York and DC-based outlets had reporters who lived there year-round. I think that we'd get part of the reason that that genre of story gets mocked is because it feels like it's
cookie cutter
reporters who are on safari and filing the same, exotic dispatches, right?
No, I agree with that. I would point you to stories that my colleague Clara Galifaro, who's based in Kentucky, has done. She grew up in coal country. She's our correspondent there. She's written a whole series of stories, and people really trust her because she's from the area. She has lived in their communities. She continues to live in their communities, and there's a richness to the story that she's telling.
That wouldn't come through if I wrote it, right?
Or
exactly.
If I had written it. And so I learn a ton from reading her stories. I think it's incredibly valuable, but you're right. It's because she has more of a connection to those communities.
She just understands it in a fundamental way.
It's like when you write about Brentwood.
Yeah, that was not where I'm from. I'm from the San Fernando Valley, the downtrodden. But there's something else that I'm talking about. I guarantee you there's some people in this room who want to ask, why are you all so damn biased in the media? And when you say bias, I'm going to offer you a little menu, right? Are you ideologically biased? Because there's that. There is liberal bias. There is secularism in the press, where there's not a lot of understanding of people of faith or the vocabulary of faith. There's geographic bias that we've just been alluding to. But there's also a proclivity to make a judgment. And the truth is that the fact that the media fell in love with Barack Obama was not totally about ideology, right? It was about him being a history-making African-American president, and he was charming, and he was change, and he wasn't the Clintons, and there's all this baggage that the press has about the Clintons. And by the way, there was also a lot of swooning that went on for George W. Bush over Al Gore. So this is a kind of bias that I think people need to own up to, and we collectively have to address, because there is a sense of disgust that and I think one can say objectively about the president that he's nasty, that he's crude, that he's profane, that he's willfully ignorant of history and does not care about the institution. I'm willing to assert all of those things. And I would invite anyone to have a respectful conversation if they disagree. And that's fine, we can disagree. But even that, all right, and there's a lot of judgment that I just made, and this goes on all the time.
I think there is a climate in the Washington press corps now where we feel like we have to not just report what's happening, we have to tell you what it means instantly. Yeah. We have to analyze it. We have to come to a conclusion, and that's where, to me, the bias shows up the strongest. I look back at some of the stories that I wrote at the end of the 2016 campaign. Some of them I'm still very proud of. Some of them I'm not, because what I was analyzing was not accurate. It was my own attempt to explain what was going on, but it didn't actually reflect what was happening in the electorate. And I think that we haven't fully learned that piece of it. Sometimes the smartest thing to do is just to say, this is what happened, make your own decision. But that has become actually a difficult thing in the Washington press corps.
I think that what you just described, all of the menu, you can wrap that up and say judgment. But it's not that simple at all. And it is very, very difficult. And I know we've been on the air together when things happen, when the President of the United States makes an assertion that is false. There's no objective truth to what he said. And I feel, and I've never had this feeling as a journalist before, it is my responsibility to say, that's not right. Now, is that bias? I don't think so. I think it would be biased to not correct it. But it is such an unfamiliar and frankly uncomfortable position as a journalist to be in. When you're talking about the President of the United States, I will never, ever get used to that.
But we have to face the fact that, and I encountered this just last week speaking at a high school in Northern Virginia, that there is this pushback against the media. They do see us, his message is resonating. And it's easy to sort of blow it off and say, well, you guys don't know what you're talking about if you think we're fake news. It's not fake news. And yet, there is a backlash to media that frankly predates Trump. So how do we, Julie, begin to take stock of that and really address it? It goes beyond the fact that we didn't really see Trump coming and we were all, complicit in the party of covering Trump because it meant great ratings and it was such a compelling story.
I think some of it is just doing the old-fashioned things that the media has always done, admitting our mistakes, being forthcoming when we get something wrong. I actually think that goes a long way. Instantly, you might get a lot of blowback, but I think that helps regain trust. I believe this really strongly. I think that we have to have a diversity of coverage. I do think that one of the ways that that the public has lost trust in us is this idea that we do get obsessed with one thing. And they can't turn on the TV or pick up their newspaper or scroll through Twitter and see a diversity of coverage. Some of that is because the way that media is now, it can be very self-selecting. So that's because you click on certain things, that you see certain stories. So there's a deeper issue there. And then the third thing I would say, which is another thing that I feel very strongly about, is we don't always have to make it about us. Mm-hmm. I think that sometimes where we have lost trust with the public is when reporters decide that this is their fight. Mm-hmm. It's not our fight. This is our fight for the public. Mm-hmm. And every time that we don't make that connection, every time we don't explain, we're trying to get you access to the president, we're trying to get you access to accurate information and not make it about my own personal seat in a room or my own personal ability to ask a question, I think that trust erodes just a little bit.
And that's why platforms matter. I mean, platforms have got to matter, or else you can have anyone with a Twitter bot, pushing out misinformation, as we saw. This is the sad part, one of the many sad parts about what the Russians did, is they pushed on an open door in our society.
Totally.
Of distrust of the media and of Democrats and so forth.
Well, and the other thing that they took advantage of was, I was talking with some students about this earlier today, because there's been this trend since the internet became a thing of democratization in media, right? The power of gatekeepers to determine what information and ideas get put out there has diminished dramatically. In a lot of ways, that's been a good thing. There's been a greater diversity of voices. The kind of, what did Spiro Agnew call the closed fraternity of privileged men who determined what got on the news don't have quite as much power anymore. So there's a lot of good there, but it's also created, like you said, a climate that is ripe for abuse and manipulation, because it's not just Russians who can put out misinformation and propaganda. It's also, frankly, bad actors here in the United States of different political and ideological persuasions who have no interest in informing or enlightening, but are, the political editor of Breitbart News said at a speech at the Heritage Foundation last year that that journalistic integrity is dead and everything now is about weaponization of information. Yeah. So, what does that mean? It means that there are people who are posing as reporters, wearing press badges, but are not in the business of reporting. They're in the business of weaponizing information in the pursuit of some ideological goal.
Right, but look, that's a big part of cable news. In the opinion part of cable news, and I do set CNN apart from this because this is how Fox News was conceived, and I know MSNBC was ultimately evolved to mirror that ideologically, and it was weaponization. It was about creating community and winning a partisan death match. Dan, I want to turn to Twitter, though, in our remaining minutes before we turn it to our audience, and we'll take your questions. We'll take some student questions first. So how do you cover the president on Twitter? We talk about this a lot, but I'm sure a lot of people wonder, should we be reporting on every tweet that the president sends out there?
Every tweet? No, not necessarily, but it's a statement. I mean, I view Twitter, first of all, as Julie said at the beginning, it is the most raw window into what the president is thinking or feeling or watching on cable news at that moment. But also, it is the modern day statement. I mean, if he, I guess it's double 180 characters, but if he would say what he tweeted out in the Rose Garden or walking out to the helicopter, it would be news. And I genuinely don't think in this day and age we can see them as any different. Having said that, just like when a president makes a statement, every statement is not the same. And every tweet should not be tweeted the same. And I do feel like in some ways we've gotten more used to it. I mean, it's just been such a brave new world, such a different kind of thing for the country, the world, but especially those of us who have covered White Houses before, to wrap our minds around this new phenomenon. And I feel like we're starting to do a better job of sifting through the little red balls that he wants us to follow and what really matters.
But what's interesting is that if President Obama were going to come out to the Rose Garden, he would be deliberately cloaking himself with the trappings of the American seat of executive power, right, which stands for something, it means something the world over, and there would be some careful consideration about what that statement would be. We know that this president just fires at will and tweets at will, no different than any of us on the street corner. That, McCabe, poses a different kind of challenge.
It does, but I would argue it makes it more newsworthy, not less.
Yeah.
I think that it's certainly true that you shouldn't necessarily treat every tweet with the same gravity that you would a Rose Garden speech or a speech to Congress, because obviously the more people who have contributed to the remarks that the president makes, the more likely it is to have the weight of the executive branch behind it. That said, when he tweets something, it's something that the most powerful person in the world is thinking, right? And he's putting it out into the world, and we have to take it seriously. But I do think it's a category difference, right? We should still cover his tweets, but not pretend like those tweets are necessarily going to translate to policy, because we've seen time and time again over the past year that they don't.
That's a great point. I mean, the classic example for me is the tweet that he sent out about rolling back the ability for transgender people to serve in the military, which was something that was being discussed in the administration, but they were nowhere close to a policy rollout. He just blurted it out. He's the commander-in-chief. He can make that decision, whether there's been a policy process or not. Our responsibility is to do the reporting behind the scenes and say, hey, the president said this, but actually they're nowhere close to doing this. And then to stay on the issue, to not let the tweet be the extent of the coverage.
What are the ramifications of what Tim Snyder writes in his little book on tyranny, which is really good, about, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's a kind of numbness in the population, an anesthetization of how we view outrageous conduct and how we view the president. So I guarantee you, I mean, you know, you could raise your hand. Who would be absolutely dumbfounded, mouth agape, you know, stop what you're doing if you saw an image of President Trump bare-chested right next to Vladimir Putin going in the little bath? You know, would that shock you, or would you just think it's, you know, it's Wednesday? And so I realize some people would be shocked. But my point is that we're getting to a place where it'd be like, wow, but yeah, I mean, this is what we expect from this guy. And what are the dangers of that?
So the moment that actually hit me was a pretty serious moment. It was the day that he fired Kobe.
Yeah.
And I was sitting in our little White House booth, and the statement came out, and we're filing on it. And it took me like a good 15 minutes before the gravity of it really hit me. Where I was like, he just fired the FBI director. Because there is so much churn. There are so many things that are astonishing and surprising. I think that the thing that we can do that helps the public, like I said at the beginning, is just to not make everything a 10.
Yeah.
We have a lot of responsibility in this situation in the amount of attention that we pay to certain provocative statements or decisions, the context that we build around it, our own kind of agitation around it. A lot of that really rests with us.
So we're going to go to questions. We've got about 19 minutes, which is a lot of time in TV time. So be crisp with your questions, and I'll make sure we get crisp answers so we get a lot of you responded to. Yes, young lady.
So before you were talking about how democratization of the news has occurred with the rise of the internet and how there are good things and bad things that come with that. And I've read a lot about how with that comes the demise of local news, which worries me because that's one of the ways that people learn about how what's going on in DC affects their lives. Can those of you who have experience in local news talk about what you think the future of that is and how it might help or hurt journalism today?
That is a fantastic question.
I've worked in local news.
Has anybody?
Yeah, so I think it's awful. And I think the demise is underway. It used to be that any local television station's big profit center was their news division. I think that's increasingly untrue. I think digital is big. There are some survivors to that, but they don't have the resources to, say, cover politics, local politics, in the way that they used to. The story's even worse when you get to newspapers, right?
So the local newspaper that I worked for in Tampa, Florida, is shut down a year and a half ago.
And that is a great state for news.
That's a great state for news. It was a 2-newspaper town. That newspaper is just gone, no longer exists. This happened in Denver. It's happened in San Francisco. To me, what I worry about in terms of the business side of the Trump phenomenon is that in Washington, it feels like we're in a gold rush.
Yes.
There's tons of hiring going on. Yeah. Media hasn't felt this way in years. We're feeling flush with cash. The eyeballs are there. None of that is translating into local news.
And by the way, the whole business is consolidating. The whole business is contracting. Network news has completely contracted. The money is not there as much. So it's interesting. There is a gold rush in certain places, but there's real challenges. Part of it is a kind of devolution that is creating all kinds of outlets that we're not going to recognize. You know, Netflix for content, Netflix is going to get into the business of live programming, I predict, and they are going to be a new center of gravity. So just a lot of it's going to change.
But the biggest thing that you all can do, pay for your local news.
Yeah.
I don't know what the Chicago Tribune model is, but if there's a paid subscription or the Sun-Times, pay for it. It is really expensive.
And that runs counter to what you're supposed to do, but you know, you got to do it. You got to pay for it. All right, thank you very much. Next young man.
Thank you all for being here today. So, what was it, last week the president had his physical and they brought out the doctor to do a press conference. One of your reporters at CNN asked if the president had heart disease and the doctor said no. And then CNN ran with a lower third graphic that said president has heart disease, and I believe Dr. Gupta was on there talking about how the president had heart disease and published an article about it. What responsibility does CNN have to report, at least even if they're providing their own color, report what the White House is saying?
Good
Or at least
question.
that the White House did say.
Dana.
Yeah.
Dana was responsible for all that.
I am not a doctor, but I do play one on TV, so I can answer that question. I actually think that was handled well, because we did report. First, we showed what the doctor said live, and then we did report what the White House doctor said. We happened to have Sanjay Gupta, who is a very good physician, who then he looked at the information and said that actually, based on what the White House put out about his physical condition, he does have heart disease. And so the fact that I give the White House so much credit for what they did, because it was a perfect example of transparency.
Absolutely.
They were very transparent. Now, the White House physician knew his audience, and he was talking about how healthy the president is and so forth. But beneath that were the facts and figures from the physical. And it was important to have, because it was because of that that someone like Sanjay Gupta and other people with medical degrees could read it and say, you know what, even though he's saying he's going to live to 200, this technically, by definition, means he has heart disease.
And it was about, they would argue, I think it's about contextualizing it in terms of the reporting. Thank you. Next young lady, thank you.
So I'm wondering what you think the relationship between the press and the public will be like coming out of the Trump presidency. And then secondly, what advice you would have for an aspiring journalist during that time?
I'll just say one thing that I worry about is that because Trump's relentless attacks on the mainstream media and the press have created a kind of a bigger chorus of admirers than maybe we had before. I know that newsrooms are getting sent pizzas by, Tom Hanks sent a new coffee machine to the White House press.
We were there when they said that the first time.
He did that before during other presidencies.
Yeah.
But my point is that there's a lot of partisan appreciation for the press. If you don't like Trump because Trump is attacking the press, you like them. My concern is that maybe some of us in the press are enjoying that a little too much, soaking that up a little too much, and it might create a situation where, with the next coming out of the Trump presidency, whoever the next president is, where too many people in the press now have a very partisan fan base that we're playing to, as opposed to seeing ourselves as disinterested, independent advocates for all of the public, the whole electorate.
At the very last White House holiday party under the Obama administration, so this is December 2016, all of the Obama officials were coming up to me and my colleagues and saying, your job is so important. Do you know how important your job is? And I would say back to them, I do, and it's been that important for the last 8 years as well. I think, but McKay is right. I mean, there is a sense that they were saying that because they felt like you need to hold him accountable. I mean, like,
right.
Our job is to hold whoever sits in that Oval Office accountable, regardless of party.
Best advice, I think, one of the things when you're younger, you've really got to be masters of how it's changing, how the business is changing, and where the new outlets are, and where you fit in. And I don't think journalism schools are really going to help you with that. It's moving too quickly. But you've got to find the new platforms and where they're looking and how it matches with your skill set. I think that's going to be really important. Thank you. The young lady behind you.
Thank you all for being here. My question is about information overload, and just within the 24-hour news cycle, there's constantly so much information being thrown at us. And as readers and listeners and watchers, how can we cut through the noise and kind of get to what's important? Like, how do we be responsible consumers of news?
Great question.
Yeah, well, you just read the AP, Atlantic, and CNN. That's pretty much it.
And then you're covered.
Next question.
One quick point that I always make when people ask this question is to seek out stories that make you uncomfortable. Like, if you, first of all, if you see a headline or a story that makes you feel a little too good about how you already see the world, be skeptical of it. And seek out information and stories and outlets and writers who are responsible, but who challenge you. I think that more than anything, if everyone did that, we'd be a lot better off as a country.
Can bravo, first of all, to that. Second of all, go deep. Okay, you have an ability, your phone is in your hand, right? So it means it's never far away. You have an ability in 20 seconds to find out the main headlines today. Everybody's making it so easy for you. Even the New York Times is like, dude, you don't have to read everything. We'll just tell you really quickly what you need to know. So you can be up on the news, spend the rest of your time going deeper. You can listen on your phone to Autumn. You can listen to The New Yorker. I just found out I can listen to The Economist. Nobody actually reads The Economist. I can now listen to The Economist. I can listen to it in my car, and it allows me to go deeper. I can go on Twitter. I go on less because I just find it so awful. But I make a list of people that I want to follow. And I curate that a little bit so that I start to make choices. You've got to be a smart consumer and find the depth. There's so much depth out there, but you've got to decide to go deep. And that's how I think you get the most out of it. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. One of the things that seems especially unique about this past year and this president is exactly how much news coverage might impact his positions.
Absolutely.
And you've talked a lot about the responsibility you've had and how it's changed toward your readers. But in a case where we have a president who, at least in the case of personnel, seems to have made decisions based on reporting in the press, how have you adapted your reporting to the fact that your stories may make policy directly with the president, that you have that very important reader? And if you haven't adjusted, how did you negotiate the decision not to?
That's such a great question, and it actually is very timely because we're in this debate over DACA in part because the president reacted to news coverage. He announced that he was rescinding Obama's DACA policy, really got pretty terrible coverage by the end of that day. He was watching his news coverage and tweeted that he was actually going to kick it to Congress and make Congress do this by March 5th, I guess it is. I don't think that we can or should account for that. I think that that would make us active participants in his decision making, which is not our role at all. I worry just as a citizen about how he reacts though to coverage. I mean, as president, as David knows, you have to make really difficult decisions that are really unpopular because they are in the best interest of the country. I don't know if Trump has the ability to live through a 2-week or 2-month negative news cycle over a decision that he made that was actually in the best interest of the country. But again, that's not on us to resolve. But that is a concern, I think, for the country.
I think it is very much a concern, but the problem is, and I totally agree, it is not up to us to think, how can I affect the president's decision making? We report what the response is by the people that matter. But part of the issue is that because of the sort of the fracture of news right now, and because the president gets his love on one particular cable news channel, that there is such an echo chamber for him that it does tend to, like I was talking about Tuesday Trump on immigration. He was watching Fox News and saw himself getting pummeled by his people and swung the other way, and there were other factors as well. So I think there is a danger in there, but that's nothing that any of us can control.
But it raises a really important point, an historical point, about the corrosive nature of crisis. I mean, look what the Vietnam War did to Lyndon Johnson, and look what Nixon's paranoia did to him. And we have in this president someone who's never been tested by the consequences of a decision or facing down a crisis, where presidential decision-making is incredibly lonely. I mean, I'm not blowing smoke, but I mean, the decision President Obama made for the raid on bin Laden, I spoke to somebody who was very senior in the intelligence community right after the decision was made, who had been there previously, and he said, let me tell you something, that could have been a disaster. And he alone decided to take it on, he made that decision. That is the testing of the mettle of a president. We haven't seen that yet, and that's a scary proposition. Thank you.
Just real quickly before I sit down, McKay, lest you be left off the hook for that one, did you have any splinter of thought about how President Trump might have responded to your piece about Vice President Pence? And I'll sit down.
Oh, interesting. So I just had a big profile run in The Atlantic of Mike Pence. It's impossible for the idea not to cross your mind because you know that in a big piece that you assume is probably going to get cable news coverage, because, I mean, look, this president doesn't read 8,000 word profiles in the Atlantic.
Yeah.
But he does watch the cable news coverage of 8,000 words.
It would if it were about him.
He saw the headline.
Maybe if it were about him. Even then, I think he'd want the Spark Notes or something. But yeah, I mean, so I had a piece in that, a bit in that story about, in the way, I won't go into all the details, but something that it suggested that Pence might not be quite so loyal to the president as he often suggests in public. And yeah, look, I knew that would probably get under the president's skin. I knew that I'm sure that it might lead to more blowback from the White House because a lot of this is driven by the president's mood. But I think that Julie's right. You try to put that out of your mind because you really can't make it about, you can't write your stories or create your newscasts for an audience of one, or else you're really doing a disservice to the rest of your audience.
So we've got just a couple minutes left. I'm going to try something that I just learned from somebody else who's really smart, who handled it this way. I see 4 of you there. Will each of you ask your question? We're going to take them, and then we're going to try to kick those around into some final thoughts. Would that be okay? So we get to everybody? Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to give it in an abbreviated form. I wanted to say it's a seldom discussed fact that before the American Civil War, which is a period that is often being compared to our present time, the United States had the highest rate of newspaper readership in the world. It was a period of a very engaged free press. Also during that time, every newspaper was explicitly, unabashedly partisan. This concept of nonpartisan, unbiased journalism didn't really exist. So I wanted to ask, in light of the fact that Fox remains the most watched channel, since the election, MSNBC has for the first time surpassed CNN, and that's the opposite partisan slant. What is the role of partisanship in journalism in light of all this talk about the necessity of being unbiased? Is there something more there than just we shouldn't have it?
Good. What's the role of partisan journalism? Yes, next.
During the White House press briefings, the Sharon Sanders seemed so contentious and abusive and abrasive. I'm just saying what I view. How do you folks deal with that when you're sitting in the room and being assaulted like that?
Not well. Thank you. And the final point, yes, sir.
I wanted to kind of follow up with what you guys were saying about the president's Twitter feed and just ask, sort of in your experiences, how has the role of social media, use by the powerful and coverage by those who hold them accountable, changed, and how will it continue to change as it becomes more ingrained into everyday life? Thank you.
Thank you all. Do we have everybody's question? Thanks. So I'm interested in, we are in a place, Dana, where partisan journalism, I would call it maybe, communities, very much do rule the roost. I mean, because there is a lot of momentum toward judgment, personality, commentary as the basis or kind of the ballast for a news delivery system. And it did used to be that way in this country for a long time. Is it necessarily bad?
No, it's not necessarily bad as long as you, assuming that the consumer knows what they're getting. And I think part of the issue is that isn't always the case. I mean, one network says that they're fair and balanced. They're not. They're very successful in their business model, we know reporters who truly are fair and balanced who work for that network and are real good journalists. But overall, that's not the mission of that network. So if I'm a consumer and I'm watching them because I agree with them ideologically, that's fine. But also seek out something that is more truly objective. I also think that we are in a time right now where people have retreated to their corners. Obviously, right. The resistance is so electrified, and they go to MSNBC. People who want Trump to succeed are going to Fox. My hope is that once we get to the actual competition again, the elections, that they're going to want to look at the referee.
And do you think that social media is a big part of the creation of communities and keeping us apart? Is there a new generation of social media that changes that dynamic, either of you?
I think potentially. I think that social media can have the same effect as cable because it's self-selecting. You can choose who you follow. I think McKay's point about choosing to follow people who will be tweeting out or posting stories that make you uncomfortable is the best way to approach it, but that is an active decision that you need to make as a consumer. I mean, I think it's fine to have partisan media, but to Dana's point, as long as it's disclosed, as long as people know what they're getting.
Well, I would also make a distinction quickly between partisan and ideological media. Ideological media is news infused with shared ideas and values and principles. Partisan press is in service of a political party, often in spite of those values. But one thing I would say is that a lot of conservatives today have made the case to me that we should just return to the pre-war era of partisan press. I think if you go back and study that era of partisan press, you find that a lot of it was corrupt. It was late. It was not usable, and it is not helpful for our political system. And I think it's good that we have a core of nonpartisan press.
And I think that, I think one of the big takeaways is that for the consumer of news and information, unfortunately, you've got to work hard to sift through this material, make judgments for yourselves, and push yourself to be open to people who are not like you and to points of view that are not like your own. That's what Jefferson talked about being an educated society and an engaged civic society is all about. And to address the point about the press briefings, having been in a few, having been a rather contentious member of the press corps with press secretaries, I will tell you the focus ought to be, it doesn't feel good to get attacked and you can get into a lot of fighting, which is counterproductive. I think the best thing is to focus on what it is you're trying to get out of that press briefing that might be new, that might be illuminating, and make it a place for accountability, but it shouldn't become some kind of show trial either. So everybody's got to stay professional and keep within themselves. So thank you all very much.
First of all, thank you, David, for doing an excellent job of moderating and bringing your own experience to this discussion. And I hope if you leave with nothing else, you'll leave with the obvious conclusion that the people who are covering this administration are doing it thoughtfully and conscientiously under very difficult circumstances. And you can see, given the answers that you've heard from these journalists tonight, that they take their responsibilities seriously, they take their craft seriously, and I, for one, am grateful not just to have them here, but to have them there. So thank you very much.